started looking at Fort McClellan, we found a lot of the same herbicides used all over Fort McClellan as was used in Vietnam. If that's true, why aren't benefits easier to get for Fort McClellan veterans? There's a lot of reasons for that. Fort McClellan was home to the Army Chemical Corps. Well, the Army Chemical Corps were the people in Vietnam that sprayed herbicides, with the exception of the ones from C-123s, that was the Air Force ranch hand. But the ones sprayed out of helicopters, the ones sprayed out of huge buffalo turbines on the ground, all the base perimeters, all of that was the Army Chemical Corps. The Army Chemical Corps, they weren't just radiation, nerve gas, mustard gas. They were also the ones that sprayed herbicides in Vietnam. That took some kind of know-how. A lot of that know-how came from Fort McClellan. The reason that is because once we look at all the old records, just the sheer volume of herbicide use that we found on the base, it's not accounted for by your average weed control activities, okay? Or your average spraying of foliage on the rights of way, or the typical places people would use herbicides back then. The quantity was outrageous. Before we can get to that, it helps to understand what a herbicide agent is. Funny, the regulations that came from the Agent Orange Act and VA's regulations, they never mention Agent Orange, okay? They refer to herbicide agents. And so you have to understand what a herbicide agent for the purpose of the presumptive service-connected disabilities are, okay? If you look in VA's regulation where it talks about what disabilities you can get benefits for if you're a Vietnam veteran, it will tell you that if on active duty you were exposed to a herbicide agent as defined at Title 38 CFR Section 3.307A6. So that chunk right there says you have to be exposed on active duty to one of the defined herbicide agents. Then you go to the other regulation at 3.307 and it tells you what a defined herbicide agent is. And it tells you that 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, and its contaminant dioxin, cocodilic acid, and picloram are herbicide agents for the purposes of VA benefits. Agent Orange was a 50-50 mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. The 2,4,5-T based herbicide is the one that was contaminated with dioxin. It's the most potent dioxin on the planet.
They all had some dioxin, but Agent Orange was the worst. And it was never intentional. It was a byproduct of the manufacturer. So it was a relatively minor component. It is very, very persistent and extraordinarily toxic. It's probably the most dangerous chemical that people have ever made. Now, it's a very dangerous thing. It changes DNA, and so it can have multi-generational effects. It causes cancer, and the birth defects are from that same mechanism. It damages DNA that can cause cancer, but if in a fetal development, that can cause these various birth defects. Basically, anencephaly, the absence of a brain, is the most significant one. But the deformities of arms and legs and cleft lips, cleft palates, all of those are very, very common. Well, if it affects DNA, it's going to have multi-generational effects. And that, of course, can be through the father as well as through the mother.
So what does that mean for Fort McClellan? Well, for example, we have records from the 70s that show the military used thousands of gallons of straight 2,4,5-T, which is the dangerous component in Agent Orange. They use thousands of gallons of 2,4-D, which is the other component in Agent Orange. And there was also thousands of gallons of arsenic-based herbicide used in Fort McClellan. So you literally had every defined herbicide agent that's in VA's regulations used all over Fort McClellan, to the point where there's a few years in the 70s that we have the actual evidence of how much each herbicide was used. And when you add those together, you could literally cover every square acre of Fort McClellan from border to border of the base. something like 100 times more than you could cover every square acre of Vietnam with all the herbicides sprayed there. Okay, that is tremendous. That is not normal weed control. When I say the ties to Vietnam and Fort McClellan are deep, they are just that. But no one ever put that together. So you would think, all right, once we found all that information, that it would be relatively easy to help veterans get benefits, okay? That's not the case. VA has a list of places that DOD has acknowledged that it used what they call tactical herbicides. Fort McClellan is not on that list. So it's kind of like VA would say, we acknowledge you were exposed to this dioxin that was in this 2,4,5-T that was used on Fort McClellan, but that's a commercial herbicide because it was used on Fort McClellan. If it was used in Vietnam, it's a tactical herbicide and somehow more dangerous. That's just not true. There's no such thing as a tactical herbicide. There's just a herbicide used in a tactical environment. VA wanted people to think if you used it in your front yard, it wasn't going to be dangerous. But if you used it in Vietnam, then it can cause all kinds of disabilities. That's the level of idiocracy that went into some of these claims. So you're talking tens of thousands of people. It's just something the government doesn't want out of the bag, and they're willing to deny veterans claims to keep it in the bag. Most of what the base was known for a number of years, with people filing claims based on exposure, was the Army Chemical Corps, and the Monsanto plant was a PCB plant that operated for a number of decades right outside, not right outside, but pretty close outside the base. Those were the exposures that were known. The Army Chemical Corps, they were the ones that would test nerve agents, mustard gas. If you were going through there, radiological decontamination, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare, that's kind of what they did. The PCBs from the Monsanto plant, that was the type of exposure that a lot of people focused on because they were significant. It was a class action lawsuit in the late 20th century. It was the largest one in the country at the time. The city of Anniston that sued Monsanto, it was a huge settlement. Monsanto had to buy up whole tracts of land because they were so contaminated. The wells were contaminated, all the waterways were contaminated. The PCBs were airborne. They detected PCBs in the bark of trees right beside the base. That can only happen with airborne PCBs.
Tree bark has enough fat in it that it becomes a passive sampler for the PCBs that are volatilized, that are in the air. Well, PCBs are all man-made. They're in fact 209 different PCB molecules. PCB 1 has 1 chlorine. PCB 209 has 10. They can be located at different sites around the molecule. PCBs with a lot of chlorines are very difficult to break down. Those are the ones that most of us have primarily in our bodies. PCBs with high chlorines we get primarily from food. All animal fats are contaminated with PCBs, all coming from the Monsanto plants in Anniston and Sauget, Illinois. They stay in your body for a long time. One particular PCB conjurer has a half-life of about 18 years. I usually say, if you had a Big Mac for dinner last night, you're going to get PCBs in it, and you're going to have half of those PCBs in your body 10 years from now. So the fact that they're so persistent is part of the problem here. PCBs cause cancer. Just like lead, they cause deficits of IQ, cause ADHD, they cause heart disease, they cause diabetes, they interfere with reproduction, they suppress the immune system, they increase risk of high blood pressure, you name it. They act on many different systems. They interfere with thyroid function, and we all have PCBs in our body because they're so present everywhere. But people that live near contaminated sites, and the groups that I've studied the most are residents of Anniston. The PCBs in the sediments of the rivers don't go away. The PCBs on land don't go away. We're all going to die with PCBs in our bodies, even though they haven't been manufactured since the late 70s.
So if it's getting to the edge of the base, it's getting on the base. And PCBs, you can't manufacture them anymore. They're really not good for you. They're right up there with the type of herbicides used in Vietnam.
I actually served at Fort McClellan, Alabama, which is now a closed Army military base. Now I was about 40 years old, early 40s. I had prostate cancer, so I didn't know exactly what to do. I did check with people at the VA center near me at the time, and they basically asked the questions, were you in Vietnam? I said no. They asked if I was in one of the other places, I assumed were the presumptive sites for people with prostate cancer in connection with Agent Orange. And I told them I was at Fort McClellan, and a very nice veteran service officer said, well, if you had Fort McClellan, it's almost like being in Vietnam. In fact, you might have had a better chance in Vietnam of not getting it than being at Fort McClellan, because it's a very hot spot there with a bunch of toxins and so forth. Well, in the meantime, I still heard stories about Fort McClellan and the civilian litigation that was going on with the local people being victimized by the Monsanto plant that produced a lot of toxins there. It made me think about my time at Fort McClellan in terms of the experience that I had there, with the training and so forth. But again, that had been, a long time ago. Talking to experts and people in the urology field, they told me that, just in general, that I might have picked up something there when I was training there. And the type of prostate cancer I had, a very aggressive cancer at a very young age, that more likely than not at that time, it came from being exposed to it in my military career. And so I really got busy at that point looking, around and talking to other folks who had been there, and found out that many of them had very similar stories as mine. And so after the passage of the PACT Act, I decided I needed to get my story before someone who could possibly give me some legitimate information about the relationship between chemicals and toxins that had been stored at Fort McClellan. Because in addition to being at McClellan for the Officer of Basic Training, I was in a reserve unit that also did law enforcement duties at Fort McClellan. So, and Anderson Army Depot, and everybody, both as a student and as a platoon leader, we trained and operated at Pelham Range, which is a military site just outside of Fort McClellan. After talking to several people and several other folks who had been victimized by many of the same symptoms that I was victimized and the same kinds of diseases, I started to look further. And I found out from those general inquiries that I guess politically it was not an easy route to go and to down that road as far as Fort McClellan was concerned. That folks would throw roadblocks in every direction, and just getting information was unbelievable. And I even, talked to some of the veteran service organizations and a couple of attorneys in the field, and nobody wanted to touch the Fort McClellan story.
And we're talking at least a 30-year time span, tens of thousands of people. It's just something the government doesn't want out of the bag, and they're willing to deny veterans' claims to keep it in the bag. But the facts and the law as applied to those facts are on our side. This isn't something that should take an act of Congress, although Congress could act. This is something that somebody with a little bit of knowledge of the use of these herbicides and what the law says about them can look at these facts and go, yeah, we have to grant these folks benefits because they can show the exposure. They can show the exposures to something that VA defines as a herbicide agent. And if they have one of those diseases listed as presumptive, then it should be an automatic service connection. So it's the low-hanging fruit. It's what's affecting the most people. But you may have somebody with a cancer that's not on that presumptive list. That doesn't mean that case is going to lose, because remember, you still have the exposure to all the PCBs. If you were on Fort McClellan, you were likely exposed to that stuff too, as well as the herbicide agents.